Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. So the general idea of the presentation today is just to focus a little bit on the gap between women's rights on paper and women's rights in practice, which is a problem that we've been working on for the last few years, and particularly explore the transformative role of education in closing that gap. So the legal and policy framework on women's rights and gender equality in the Americas is the strongest after Western Europe. So legally, and by that I mean on paper, women enjoy a wide range of rights on equal terms with men, but the persistent gap between women's rights on paper and their rights in practice is one of the biggest obstacles that we face to sustainable development, effective democratic governance, and human security. And what I mean by that is because of lack of implementation, lack of budgets, lack of general support to the implementation of these laws, women are not in their day-to-day lives really able to exercise all the human rights that they have the right to on paper. So as I said, the role of education in closing this gap is very important, and that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. Just a bit of background on the Inter-American Commission of Women before we get started. I promise it'll be short. The Inter-American Commission of Women was created in 1928. So this year we're celebrating our 90th anniversary. It joined the OAS 20 years later in 1948 as what we call a decentralized autonomous body. It was the first intergovernmental body, and it continues to be the only continental policy forum for the promotion of women's rights and gender equality. The CIM itself is made up of 34 principal delegates. That's one for each of the 34 OAS member states, and she's usually the minister for women or whatever her equivalent is at the national level. So sometimes it's a minister of women, sometimes it's a head of a gender bureau, sometimes it's the president of an institute of women, but in any case, it's usually the highest level of government authority responsible for gender equality and women's rights issues. The mission of the CIM is to support the OAS member states in fulfilling all the commitments that they've acquired at the international and inter-American levels in the area of women's human rights and gender equality. So most of the states have signed and ratified all of the different international and inter-American treaties on women's rights and gender equality issues like CEDAW or the Bulemdo-Padà Convention, and we try to support them in making those commitments a lived reality for women. So we spent most of the 1900s establishing and strengthening the legal framework on women's rights, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then since about 2000, we've sort of passed from creating the legal framework to its application, so from words to deeds. I should mention that the Inter-American Commission of Women also includes the technical secretariat of the follow-up mechanism to the Bulemdo-Padà Convention. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too, later as well. Just a general historical perspective on the exclusion of women. I'm sure, as most of you know, women have been excluded from social, political, and economic life throughout history as the result of a gender hierarchy that includes the separation of the public and the private spheres, a clear allocation of roles for men in the public sphere and for women in the private sphere, and the prioritization of the public over the private, and therefore of the role and the work of men over that of women. Which has led to discrimination, again, violence against women acting as barriers to their insertion and their action in the economic, social, and political spheres throughout history. Just a quick note before we go on. It's important for us, and I think for our work, that we not consider women as just one homogenous group. For a lot of women, the progress that we've made over the last decades has meant a radical change in their social position, but for a lot of other women, it hasn't, because gender equality intersects with other aspects of their identity, like their socioeconomic status, their ethnicity, their age, their race, their physical ability, their geographic location, their immigration status, their sexual orientation. The list is very long, I won't name everything, and that aggravates their exclusion. So their experience of discrimination is nuanced, not only by their sex and gender identity, but also by all of those other factors. And these women continue to live far from the reality of social inclusion, and it acts as an additional barrier to the full exercise of their rights. So in everything that we do from the CIM, the diversity approach, or what we call intersectionality, is essential. So to go back to the legal framework, or women's rights on paper, that I was talking about before, on paper, women enjoy a wide range of rights on equal terms with men. So beginning in 1933, when the OAS, or at that time it was the Inter-American Conference of States, adopted the Convention on the Nationality of Women, which recognized women's right to hold their own nationality even if they were married to a man with a different nationality. And over the years, we've gradually adopted agreements on women's civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. This all culminated in 1979 with the adoption at the United Nations of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW. And since then, the work in the legal framework has really been expanded to focus on specific issues that we felt were acting as particular barriers to the full exercise of women's human rights. So, for example, in 1994, the Organization of American States adopted the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, which we call the Berlin-Dopeda Convention. Or, as another example, the International Labor Organization has adopted a number of conventions on specific topics like equal remuneration, discrimination in employment, workers with family responsibilities, the protection of maternity, or decent work for domestic workers. And just related to education, I'll point out one particular article of one particular treaty, which is that every woman has the right to be valued and educated free of stereotyped patterns of behavior and social and cultural practices based on the concepts of inferiority and subordination. So that's really the foundation for all of our work on education, and education from a gender perspective. So the biggest remaining gap in terms of the legal framework on women's rights today in the Americas is still sexual and reproductive rights. While a lot of political level agreements from 1994 on have recognized the existence of women's sexual and reproductive rights and done a pretty good job of defining them, there still isn't a legally binding document at either the international or the inter-American levels that guarantees and protects women's sexual or men's sexual and reproductive rights. So women still don't have the right to decide, exercise, and control either their sexuality or their reproductive function in conditions of equality with men and free from discrimination, prejudice, and violence. In addition to being a violation on its own, this reality is an obstacle to women's ability to fully exercise their other human rights, such as their right to physical integrity or to the highest attainable level of health, or to access to education and employment, or their right to participate in political, economic, social, and cultural life. Most recently, 193 countries or member states of the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 5 is achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. And target 5.6 under that goal is to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights as agreed in accordance with the Cairo Program of Action and the Beijing Platform for Action. And those are two of those political agreements that I just mentioned that were adopted respectively in 1994 and 1995. And they're not legally binding for the states that signed on to them, but they're nonetheless very important political commitments. So moving from women's rights on paper to women's rights in practice, and I wanted to start with the area of education because that's what brings us together today. So in most of the countries of the region, the enrollment of women at all levels of education, so primary through higher education, is actually starting to exceed that of men. So there are now more women enrolled than men. And in fact, there's been a worrying trend over the last decade of a growing number of men dropping out of formal education, usually about halfway through high school. That said, the intersection of gender with other factors such as social class or race or ethnicity or geographic location does act as a barrier for the participation of a lot of girls and adolescents in formal education, particularly from poor, indigenous, Afro-descendant, and rural communities. There are a few other realities that undermine the permanence of young girls and women in school as well as their levels of performance when they're in school, and I'll mention 4 of them just because they're particularly important. One is child marriage and early union. 23% of girls in the Americas are formally married or in an informal union before the age of 18. And they get into those for a multiplicity of reasons, including cultural pressure, the fact that they don't feel like they have any other way to guarantee their financial future because they don't have any education or employment opportunities in front of them, because they're trying to escape violence in their own household, because it gives them a certain level of social status that they wouldn't get any other way. There are a whole host of reasons why girls get married or in early union earlier, but that tends to be a barrier to their continuing their education. Related to that, of course, is child and adolescent pregnancy, and that's, as I said, related to the lack of sexual and reproductive rights in the region, as well as violence against women. There's the economic marginalization of girls and young women, and often their responsibility for either productive employment or maintenance of the household, or both. A lot of girls drop out of school either to go and get jobs to support their household, or to maintain their household while their older brothers or their mothers or their fathers or all of the above go out and find productive employment. And then the final issue that I wanted to point to was violence against women in educational institutions. We don't have a lot of information about how that happens in the Americas. Unfortunately, the data is not good, but we do know that violence against girls in school, from symbolic violence, psychological violence, to actual physical violence, is a pretty significant problem. And then continuing with education, the education system itself can also be an obstacle to achieving education under equal conditions. We still have in the region curriculums that reproduce discriminatory norms and stereotypes about men and women and what should be their behavior. If we're not actually reproducing discriminatory norms, then we have supposedly gender-neutral curriculums that don't necessarily promote gender equality or human rights or nonviolence, so they're not proactively seeking to instill those values. There is, in a lot of the region, a false secularity in education. So while education may seem to be secular in practice, a number of different churches have a kind of a stranglehold on moral education, and have successfully succeeded in blocking sexual and reproductive rights education or comprehensive sexuality education from basic education curriculums. There are the existence of discriminatory teaching practices, so consciously or unconsciously giving boys more space to participate, criticizing girls more, rewarding stereotypical behavior. And then we're still seeing a preponderance of men in subjects such as science, mathematics, engineering, computing, and medicine. And that is starting to change gradually, but it's changing a little bit more slowly than the number of women in other fields. Moving on to the world of work, just because it's so closely related to education. Like the participation of women in education, their participation in the labor market has increased significantly in recent decades. In fact, the World Bank confirms that were it not for the participation of women in the labor market over the last few years, the rate of poverty in the Americas would be 28% higher than it is right now. However, despite the advances that they have made in the field of education, we're not seeing a corresponding progress in the world of work, and women still have less participation in employment and higher incidence of unemployment than men. They participate more in different forms of job insecurity, so unregistered salaried jobs, self-employment, with low productivity, part-time jobs in the informal economy, none of which come with the benefits of sort of formal employment. Lower average income under similar conditions of occupation and education, so what we call the gender pay gap, which has been in the news quite a lot lately. And then limited access to property and inheritance, to land and credit, and to access and control over resources and services, which is a significant barrier to women's ability to start and to grow their own businesses. So all of that to say that women don't derive the same benefits or the same autonomy or economic independence from their participation in productive employment as men do. Underlying all of this is still the sexual division of labor, which is that women remain almost exclusively responsible for unpaid caregiving and domestic work. And this is work that has no social or economic value. So if men don't want to do it, women don't want to do it either. But we've been responsible for it historically, and we're still largely responsible for that. And it does act as a barrier to women's ability to participate in a lot of formal employment. I'm going to say just a couple of words about the role of the media, just because the media and education together are two of the tools that we see as fundamental to either, on the one hand, perpetuating or challenging existing gender roles. So the media is both a reflection of and an engine for perceptions, attitudes, and social behavior about gender. They can play a fundamental role in deconstructing inequalities and in covering news from a gender and human rights perspective, although they can also, and this is more the case now, play a role in perpetuating stereotype images of men and women, and these images are generally denigrating for women, usually with the purpose of selling something. So they use women's bodies to sell almost everything, really, cars, beer, you name it. I'm sure there's an ad for it out there somewhere. And then they also use women, and they continue to use women in stereotyped roles to sell mostly household goods. So they show them washing dishes because they know that women are going to make decisions for the household about which dish soap to buy. Or they show them washing the clothes because women are the ones that make the decision about which laundry soap to buy. Or taking care of children. It is gradually starting to change, but the number of ads out there that show men taking on any of these domestic and caregiving roles are still relatively few. As a corollary to that, the vision of masculinity that continues to dominate in the media. So men as providers, they're controlling, they're aggressive, and they're even violent. They, of course, have a counterpart in a passive, submissive, caretaking and accommodating woman. And really this in no way corresponds to the reality of today's women. And I think it's even less and less reflective of today's men. But it continues to dominate the public discourse. So as we work with the media, we also think it's fundamental to work with education. So the work of the Inter-American Commission of Women has focused mostly on trying to influence the meetings of the Inter-American meetings of ministers of education, who adopt a lot of sort of resolutions and agreements and guidelines that influence how education gets done in this region. And we've made quite a lot of concrete recommendations to these meetings on how to incorporate gender equality and human rights perspectives into education curricula from basic primary education all the way up to higher education. Just this year, actually, we released a report on the implementation of the Inter-American Convention on Violence Against Women. We decided to focus this time on the prevention of violence because our efforts to address violence against women in the past have weighted pretty heavily towards either punishment through the justice sector or responding to victims of violence through the provision of specific services. And we've really never put that much emphasis on how to prevent violence, in part because we don't really know how to prevent violence, and in part because we don't know how to measure when we've been successful at preventing violence. So this particular report, which we just released about a month ago, is an in-depth analysis on violence prevention efforts in the region, which unfortunately are few and far between. So only 6 states reported having national plans aimed at eradicating gender stereotypes in education. Only 12 states reported regulation on the right to be educated and trained free from discrimination, and there was very little response from the states on the existence of specific protocols for action and attention in cases where women's right to be educated free of stereotype patterns is being violated. And we noted an important gap between the existence of these national regulations on the one hand and the existence of concrete tools to support their implementation on the other hand. So while there may be national plans or regulations on the right to be educated free from gender stereotypes, there's very little in terms of concrete tools to make that a reality. So how to do it. Although I will highlight a few as we go over some of the recommendations that have been made from the Inter-American system. The first one, eliminate practices and prejudices that discriminate against women and girls in educational settings. Mexico, for example, has a whole series of tools for teachers on how to address gender equality at different educational levels, from the primary level all the way to higher education. I should point out that the tools that I've included in the presentation here are all in Spanish, and it's not because there aren't any tools in English, it's just because the states that responded to us are all Spanish speaking. If any of you have ideas or suggestions of tools that already exist, or if you would like me to do a little bit more research after this webinar, I'm happy to do so. Please get in touch. Another recommendation was sensitizing educational authorities and teachers on the curriculum revisions that are necessary to eliminate gender stereotypes and to create an educational environment free of violence. So in that sense, Chile has developed a whole roadmap for the incorporation of the gender approach in education that is pretty useful from a teacher perspective, in terms of not only curriculum content, but how I, as a teacher, can avoid the types of practices that might be replicating gender stereotypes. Some of the recommendations that have been made at the country level in terms of changing gender norms and increasing women's participation in education is including women from marginalized groups in decision-making and action, creating learning spaces for things like clubs for girls that are specifically dedicated to, and one example of that is that with the support of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, they've just created specific spaces for indigenous girls and women in Guatemala to have more access to education. And they've also created for Peruvian girls from rural areas specific spaces where they can go and acquire science and technology skills, because these are sort of areas where there was a gap before. The inclusion of sex education, as I mentioned, in basic education curriculum, as well as literacy programs, effectively addressing gender-based violence in schools, working with children and young people on gender equality issues, and then working with religious communities as well, because it's not just about what kids are learning in school, but also about what they're learning at home and in their communities. Continuing with the different recommendations that we've made, coordinating with relevant government bodies to incorporate the gender and human rights approach into educational curricula and into non-formal educational environments. So Chile, for example, developed a whole education for gender equality plan that covers the 2015 to 2018 period, and they provided specific tools as well to their teachers, as well as basic education curriculum on promoting gender equality and eliminating violence against women. Encouraging educators to demonstrate the benefits for all of education for human rights and gender equality, and offering certified tools for professional development to teachers at all levels of the education system. And then expanding the work of education for human rights beyond the education sector to include other spaces and key actors, including mothers and fathers, trade unions, organizations of educators, and religious groups, among others. And here I wanted to make a point about the current reality of the Americas is that a lot of education sectors or ministries of education have actually tried to include some of these gender equality and human rights considerations in their basic education curricula, and they've been met with a backlash from mostly community-based social groups and religious organizations who have somehow developed the belief that gender equality means the promotion of homosexuality and the destruction of the family. So just as an example, a couple of years ago, the Ministry of Education in Peru decided to introduce a basic gender equality curriculum, and that gave rise to a whole social movement, Con mis hijos no te metas, which in English is don't mess with my kids, sort of asserting their right as parents, and I put right in quotation marks because that's not actually a recognized right, their right to educate their children however they see fit. Because they're worried that all of this gender equality and feminism stuff means the destruction of society and the destruction of the family. So there was a pretty significant social backlash against that unfortunately meant that the Ministry of Education did withdraw or revise their gender equality curriculum and watered it down pretty significantly. So there is a need for us to be very clear on what we mean by gender equality and human rights when we're talking about introducing it into basic education curricula. We're basically looking for equality between girls and boys, and that girls have the same access to opportunities that boys do. Moving on to the recommendations, and this is important to what I was talking about before, is including the issue of masculinities in all education curricula with emphasis on healthy and respectful power and gender relations, the peaceful resolution of conflict, and the exercise of sexuality and conditions of equality and freedom from discrimination. And this speaks to the damage that's done by traditional gender roles, not just to women, but also to men. Articulating the work of the education sector with other relevant sectors like health or justice or security, and ensuring that education policies have a participatory impact evaluation component. And that's particularly important because I think we need to be able to monitor the impact that our efforts to educate from a gender perspective are having. Modifying public policies and practices in educational institutions that create barriers that prevent women from having freedom of choice about areas of study and career options. So making sure that some of the barriers that currently exist to women participating in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, medicine, and other traditionally male-dominated fields are addressed. And then establishing clear legislative and public policy measures that allow for the development of skills and interests free from gender stereotypes from the youngest age. Ensuring that when women pursue activities and disciplines that are dominated by men, they're protected from sexual harassment and violence. There's been quite a lot of coverage in the news lately of the sexual harassment and abuse that's faced by women, particularly in the technology sector, companies like Google or Facebook. Promoting self-esteem, dialogue, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts, again, from the earliest of ages right up through higher education. And then promoting the acceptance of differences as a source of mutual enrichment. So not just gender differences between women and men, but all types of differences and diversity. And then finally, approving protocols to develop state capacities to address situations of violence against women in education settings. And there, this is Spain, so not an OAS member state, but they have a portal called Educate Inequality that has a number of resources on how to address violence against women in educational institutions from primary school right through higher education again. And then Argentina has a series of courses for teachers on how to address gender violence in adolescent couples and in educational settings, which is pretty interesting as well. So I'll stop there for now. I'm happy to send out any of the materials that I referenced in this presentation, or like I said, I'm happy to look for materials in English because we didn't have them from the member states, but I know that they're out there. So if you guys have any questions, please do feel free to submit them via the chat now. Oh, we do actually have some now. Let me just go check those. Oh, here we go. So Valentina asks, what's the role of teachers, principals, parents, and policymakers in promoting the inclusion of gender perspective in the classroom? The role of all of them is fundamental and different. As I said before, it's really important to make sure that what's being taught in the classroom is complemented and reinforced by what's being taught at home and in communities. So if you have the formal education system saying one thing about gender equality and women's rights, and then you go home or you go to church and they're saying something completely different, it's very confusing for kids. And honestly, they're more likely to listen to what their parents tell them than what their teachers tell them. And I think that's a wisdom that we've come to accept over the last few years, is that formal education only goes so far. And so the role of parents in promoting gender equality and women's rights issues is absolutely fundamental. And like I said, I think we need to be very clear about what we mean when we talk about gender equality, that we mean equal opportunities for girls and boys, and find more effective ways of addressing those with parents, with communities, and with religious organizations. Next question is from Median. What strategies can we apply in our classroom in order to promote gender equality? And also, how can we as teachers involve parents to work on gender equality? That's a good question. I think there are a number of different strategies. I know that education curricula are sometimes out of the control of individual teachers, but certainly teachers can look at how they themselves teach, their own practices, their own methods and methodologies. I know that even I tend to catch myself I have a 3-year-old son talking to the kids in his class and telling the girls that they look pretty, or telling the boys that they're brave, or so even in our own interaction with children on a day-to-day basis, we can look at the ways that we might be replicating gender stereotypes and try to address those. And then I think it's important that teachers, even at sort of the local community level, have as much dialogue as they can with national level educational authorities to make sure that they're all aware of the reality at the community level and how best to orient educational materials to respond to those. And then involving parents is it can be difficult. I think that the best way is really to highlight the benefits of gender equality for both girls and boys when you're talking to parents. So say that it's a question of boys being more involved in their own family lives, of having a little bit more access to some of those emotional and effective relationships that women have, and women, on the other hand, are not letting go of that, but they're enriching their own lives by having more access to economic and employment opportunities and professional development. And hopefully it contributes to making both girls and boys more well-rounded people as they grow. And I think that's probably the best way to get parents on board with the gender equality in education thing. And then Median again, gender equality is really a serious issue because all of us need to understand that everyone needs to respect each other, but I'm very concerned about the increase of femicide in my country. That's why it's actually an interesting webinar to get different ideas to face the social situation that we have to try to overcome. That's very true. Median, I'm not sure which country you're from, but we've seen an increase in femicide in a number of countries in the region, and we're concerned about it as well. We're developing legislative and awareness raising tools for national governments to try to, oh, you're from Ecuador, okay, great. We're developing a model inter-American law on femicide that will hopefully allow countries to recognize that femicide exists on the one hand and to typify it in their criminal codes. And on the other hand, we have to do a little bit more, I think, awareness raising about what femicide is, particularly through the media, because I think a lot of them still don't get it. And there's still a lot of sort of sensational coverage of the murder of women, along the lines of he killed her because he loved her, or he killed her because she cheated. It was like a crime of passion, right? Because she cheated on him and she deserved to die, or he thought she cheated on him. So there's still a lot of misunderstanding around the gender-based murders of women, and I think there's a need for us to do quite a lot of work about it. It's an interesting situation in Costa Rica recently around the presidential election that it ended up coming down to sort of an ultra-conservative candidate and a quite a progressive candidate who's the one who eventually won. But during the period where they were fighting it out in the polls before the second round of election, there was actually a 50% increase in femicides in Costa Rica. And it's interesting because that ultra-conservative discourse does legitimate violence against women. And the more coverage it has in public, the more dangerous that is for women. So no, we still need to do a lot of work in terms of getting people to understand what femicide is and how to address it, and gender-based violence in general. That seems to be it for the questions. Thank you so much for joining me today. I had fun talking to you guys, and I hope to do it again in a future webinar. And please do let us know if you have any questions or if you'd like access to any of the resources that I talked about today. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. We are going to close this session right now, and if you want, you can join us at the itenamericas.org Gender and Education group, where you can find all the resources from this webinar. Thank you so much, Hilary, and stay around for more information on our newsletter. Thank you.